This speaker series is the second installation continuing from last year. And we were so thrilled with the turnout, with a lot of different departments and programs and populations from Rutgers represented, as well as a greater population across the United States and beyond. And we're so thrilled about that because we think that the message of highlighting the connection between language and social justice is one that we want to spread widely, and one that we think is important for educators at all levels and students of all levels to understand and appreciate. And that's why we're particularly thrilled tonight about the format of tonight's presentation to kick things off. If you haven't already taken a look at our Language and Social Justice Initiative website, I encourage you to do so and check out the speaker series that we have going on throughout the year, starting tonight and continuing through the spring. I've put the link to that in the chat area. We're thrilled about the diversity of topics and speakers, and we hope you'll join us. So pay attention to all of the advertisements that are coming out. And all of this is made possible by a number of people working hard behind the scenes and funding that was made available for this initiative from the Chancellor's Office. We think it's totally in line with President Holloway's message about beloved community, and with the academic master plan's emphasis on inclusive pedagogy. I want to especially acknowledge the hard work of the staff at the Language Center, Kate and Patty, and our postdoctoral associate, Carly Dickerson, who joined us here at Rutgers after completing her PhD at The Ohio State University. I watch a lot of college football, so I know to introduce her that way, and we won't hold it against her that she's a Buckeye. But we're really, in all seriousness, so happy to have Carly join us because she brings in that sociolinguistic emphasis that we've been craving, and her organizational skills, I think, shine tonight, and they will throughout the spring semester. So that's enough out of me. I'm thrilled to pass it on to one of my co-directors, Nicole Hauser, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Kristen. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is an honor and pleasure for me to present our featured speaker this evening, Dr. Netta Aveneri. Dr. Aveneri is language teacher education associate professor and intercultural competence committee chair at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. She teaches critical service learning and teacher education courses at California State University, Monterey Bay. Netta is co-editor of Language and Social Justice in Practice, author of Research Methods for Language Teaching, Inquiry, Process, and Synthesis, co-editor of Metalinguistic Communities, Case Studies of Agency, Ideology, and Symbolic Uses of Language, and series editor for Critical Approaches in Applied Linguistics. She serves as the American Association for Applied Linguistics Public Affairs and Engagement Committee Chair. And Netta's research interests include language and social justice, critical interculturality, heritage language socialization, and ethical community partnerships. And Netta's work has greatly influenced my work in curriculum development toward language and social justice initiatives and this initiative overall. And I know that her work has also greatly influenced many of my colleagues, both within the Language and Social Justice Initiative, the Rutgers English Language Institute, and Rutgers broadly. So welcome, Netta.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you to Kristen and to Carly and everyone who's involved in the Language and Social Justice Initiative and in the Language Engagement Project more broadly, for inviting me to speak and talk and interact with all of you this afternoon, evening, morning, night, wherever you may be. So just to start off, it would be great if we can just put into the chat, maybe where you are right now. If you want to share your institution or anything like that, it would be great to see who all is here. So if you might add that into the chat, that would be great. So we have a number of people from Rutgers, New Brunswick, and then also from the Ohio State University. So we are going to start with an activity. And so we're going to go right into kind of modeling some of what we're going to be talking about a little bit later. So I'll share my screen for just a moment before we go there. So what we're going to be talking about today is cultivating a language and social justice praxis, reflection, action, and dialogue for social change. And I really do envision this as a conversation that I'm here to facilitate, so that we can all feel heard and explore the topics that are relevant for each of us professionally. So what we're going to do quickly in the breakout rooms is to share with your partner or partners the story of your name. And by this, you can share anything you feel comfortable sharing, whether it's about your first name, if you have a middle name, your last name, and any or all of those, and share as much or as little as you feel comfortable sharing. And then your task as a partner is to listen to your partner's name story and to ask a question about their name story. And what we're really going for here at the beginning is to enact and embody critical empathy. And by that, I mean not just understanding what it's like for someone else or to take on their perspective, but to also recognize the limits of our ability to really understand what it's like for someone else to walk through the world. All right, everyone. So how did it go? Was it interesting?
It was wonderful, Netta.
Great. Awesome. That's great. That's lovely to hear. Yeah, and it looks like in the chat as well, there's some good reactions to the activity. I'm sure some of you either use this in class or have done it before, which is great. I feel like every time I do it, I find out something new, either about myself or about other people. But if you might be willing to just share in the chat, and you don't have to go into any kind of detail about what you learned from your group mates, but just something an insight that you learned through doing the activity itself, or if you feel like you'd use something like this in your own educational practice, any reactions to the activity or what you learned specifically in the chat would be great. Yes. Yes, my sister is here. Yes. Yes. Yeah, good to connect with each other, relating to one another, different perspectives. And I mean, I'm imagining, did you learn something about each other's families? I'm imagining maybe cultural backgrounds, the regions where people have lived or grown up, right? So there's a lot that you can get just from that one small thing that we can do at the beginning. And yeah, that helps too. Barbara's mentioning that everyone was very open, and that obviously coming with that intention helps with an activity like this, of course, so that really can foster the connections as well. Well, thanks everybody for being so open for the immediate breakout rooms with each other. Yes, great, perfect. Yes, okay, so Alma's bringing up also an interesting point, which I would actually like for us to explore together. So what we're going to be discussing today, it's going to be personal in some cases, it's about our professional practice. I'm going to share with you in a few minutes some kind of community agreements that we can all maybe kind of adhere to or plan to honor. But a lot of what I write about and what I teach my students is when we're doing this kind of work, tensions come up. So either tensions internally or external tensions. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about is like how to recognize that those tensions are there and to cultivate like dispositions and practices for how to navigate those with other people. And so how to create spaces of dialogue where you can acknowledge that something difficult is being discussed, and then kind of decide together, how are we going to work through this? So I appreciate also recognizing things like some of us may have stories where our name has been mispronounced, misunderstood, assumptions are made about us because of our name, etc. So that is really important to acknowledge. Thank you for that, Alma. So I'm going to share my screen again. And all right. Okay. So just to give you an overview of what we'll do together today. So at the very beginning, I'll just give a very quick definition for praxis. And then I'll go over and we'll discuss those community agreements that we can all hopefully adhere to during our time together. And then I'll just give some frameworks and some approaches for ways of thinking about what social justice is, and we'll all have an opportunity to explore for ourselves our own definitions as well. And then we'll get into language and social justice connections. We'll look at some case studies together. And then our last, 20 minutes or something before we go to Q&A is really practical oriented. We'll look at this thing called the equity literacy framework, and then we'll look at some scenarios together and kind of build our own guiding principles for this work moving forward. So how does that sound? Okay, my intention is that we make this as interactive as possible, while also recognizing, I'm sure many of us have had the experience where you're kind of having the conversation and then there's like another conversation in the chat, like where it's sort of like the two things are happening. So I think, I think we want to, I do encourage you to use the chat to share your perspectives, and just recognizing that we don't want to force people to have to toggle back and forth, but just to try to make everything kind of relevant for everyone to hear, if that makes sense. So it's a both and, that the chat is used to kind of foster the bigger conversation. So, right, so let's do it. So let's do Praxis. Okay, so Praxis from Freire 1972 is reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. And I'm sure many of us are already familiar with this idea and use it in our daily practice as well. So the idea of Praxis here in the middle, and this visual comes from this WordPress site here that I've linked at the bottom if you're interested in finding it or using it yourself. The idea is that we're bridging theory with reflection, with action. And then it's a iterative cycle where, once we act, we reflect, was that okay? We see how that builds our theory, and it's sort of that never ending cycle. Obviously there's a lot that's been written about Praxis, and a new-ish book that you can also take a look at is Liberating Praxis, Paulo Freire's Legacy for Radical Education and Politics. And also I recently found this great resource as well that I've linked below. If you're interested, you're welcome to email me if you'd like the slides. I can also talk with Carly and others if there's a way to kind of share it more broadly with everybody. So feel free to we can figure that out together for sure. So in the vein of reflection and action with one another, I have these community agreements. So we'll just take a minute for you to read them over. I'm sure you've done these kinds of things in other spaces, and you may have things you'd like to add or edit from the list. This comes from a group at the Middlebury Institute called Queers and Allies at MISS, and then a group of students that I worked with last fall with the Symposium on World Languages Education, adapted it, and then I adapted it further for us for today. But we can just quietly read through each of them for our agreements with one another at this time. Okay. So I'm just going to start reading through them. So the first is that when we're having these conversations with one another, I think whenever we're having a conversation with anybody about anything, is assuming positive intent, while also balancing that with being accountable for the impact of your actions and words. So it isn't only about intent, and it isn't only about impact, but it's really us together balancing that. Even if you didn't mean to do something, that you can be accountable for what impact it did have on someone else. There's a lot of great frameworks recently also, which I can share with Carly to share with others later, about calling people in versus calling people out. And so calling people in is more about fostering dialogue with one another when you do have disagreements, as opposed to kind of pointing at the person and saying, you said something you shouldn't have, or you don't really get it. So that's the intention for us today, hopefully. And then also coming to the discussion with kindness for each other and for yourself, challenging ideas, but not people. We'll talk the whole time. We're going to be talking about how language is important, but even in our interactions with one another, being inclusive and respectful with how we interact with each other. Using I statements, meaning, when we're talking about experiences around things like race, class, gender, sexuality, that we're talking about those from our own perspectives without immediately going into generalizations. And that's, again, an intention. I'm sure people will engage in some generalizing during the conversations, but being intentional about when and why that is happening. And then I really like this that the students put together, which is, it's called WAIT, which is asking yourself, why am I talking? And also, why aren't I talking? So when you're kind of to think about, why don't I want to share right now? Is this really something I need to reflect on later? Or why am I talking so much? And to sort of allow for the silences and that negotiation with one another. And in that vein, recognizing we are all responsible for this space. As I said earlier, I am hopefully facilitating a process for all of us. And then what's said here stays here, like Vegas. And then what's learned here leaves here, meaning we are creating a space together now where we're exploring a lot of different things about our personal and professional lives. And so the idea isn't that you then tell someone else's story in another space without their permission, but that you are taking the insights and what you've learned and what you've gained from the experience. So that's the idea. So if that makes sense, you're sort of respecting sort of the confidentiality of the space. So just any reactions to the list? Do you want to add things? Do we want to edit to the list? Any reactions that you might have? And if you prefer to unmute instead of chat, that's fine too. And for the benefit of those who are watching recordings later, I'm just going to sometimes sort of narrate the chat. So, what I'm seeing is it looks great, strong guiding principles, love how memorable they are. So are we feeling okay about them? Good. Yes, Barbara.
Okay. Hi. Good evening, everyone. I agree with Kristen. I love that last one about what's said here stays here, something that I have always incorporated in class. And that really, to me, is the basis of safety. So to make the conversation a safe place for everyone. And I love the whole thing, but that WAIT idea, that acronym is wonderful. I even took notes on it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I love that one too. When the students shared it with me, I was like, yeah, that's a really good way to kind of allow for silence and processing and reflection, and not just like, I have something to say, so I'm going to say it kind of thing. Thank you, Barbara. One thing I will mention is, and I've written about this in different contexts, is that my intention in these conversations is to create a nest, meaning that if we're thinking of a nest as a metaphor, that it's a space of both like comfort, safety, and home, feelings of security and home. But if we're also thinking of it like from the perspective of the birds themselves, that it also might feel kind of precarious, that there's some risk involved, and that you kind of are depending on other people to make you feel okay, right? And so that's always my goal, is to create a space where we're balancing like comfort and challenge. And for each individual person, that's going to look quite different, but that collectively, that's what we're going for, right? So I think, to your point, Barbara, that we feel safe enough to then explore and maybe challenge each other or be in a bit of a dialogue. So, okay. So if we could just put into the chat, I have a few guiding questions here. Is how do you define social justice, or what are some of the components that you think of when you hear the term social justice? Where does that definition come from for you? If you've learned about it, if you've enacted it in your own pedagogy, if anything that you want to share about where it came from. And then also any specifics that you can think of for how language and social justice are connected. So take your time, think about the responses, and then as you're ready, you can just add those to the chat. There's so much good material in here, everybody. I'm just like taking it all in. So yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, and I'm seeing for some of you, you're taking some quotes from other sources and everything, which is all really useful for us. So just to highlight a few ideas, there's a lot that we can discuss just at this point in our time together, but social justice is fighting for what's right, contestation of power, and transforming those dynamics, fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity, equality and privilege, spaces where people feel recognized and heard. Oh, that's a cool idea. Self-emptying service to honor dignity. I've never heard that. That's amazing. And yeah, and I see also Natalie is sharing specifically within your multilingual writing classroom what that looks like for the students and for you in terms of your pedagogy. So we can very quickly apply this to the specifics of our own professional practice. So thank you, everybody. You have gone far beyond what my slides are about to do, but at least maybe it gives us like a collective starting place. So just to build on what everybody has shared. Okay, so my colleague Danny Martinez and I have been working on a special issue for the Journal of Applied Linguistics that's coming out soon with a number of colleagues who have been doing applied linguistics work with communities. And after we read everybody's amazing papers, we just came down to the fact that social justice is relational and social justice is aspirational. Meaning that social justice is about solidarity with others, and it is a reimagination of our world. Okay, and we are obviously building off of the papers that were in the special issue and all of those authors who were working with community members, and then all kinds of scholars and other people who've been thinking and working in this area, including one framing that I really like is that social justice is a process and a goal. And so it's a kind of a both and, that it's where we want to go, and it's also the process itself in terms of building a social justice space. So that's just a starting place for us. Again, not adding yet the language piece, but just thinking about it more broadly. And then just to add some other pieces to the mix, Pickauer in 2012 talks about 6 components of social justice, including human rights, equitable access to resources and opportunities, and then the respect for one another, representation and recognition. So just thinking about, just wonder what Natalie was just saying about her multilingual writing classroom. And when we think about representation and recognition for students, and also for the languages that they know, that will really, come into being in a very specific way in her classroom. So social justice can be all of these things and more, as we've just seen in the chat. And so just to ground this in what we're going to talk about as it relates to Praxis. So what we're just looking at are theories about what social justice is based on real life situations and things in the world. So when we ground that in Praxis, we have some of these guiding questions. Now, these are not things we're going to answer today, but they are things I'm hoping that you can reflect on as we engage in these activities, including who am I and what do I believe? Where is my context? So at the macro level, is it in the United States, in what region, and all the way down to my institutional context, the micro context of my classrooms. And then micro is something I made up. So if you haven't seen it before, it's fine. But micro would be individuals, right? So micro usually includes like both interpersonal and individuals, but I like to actually make it its own level, which is that each individual has something to bring into the mix. So that's why and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but that idea of really understanding each individual on their own terms. And other guiding questions might be, what are my goals in relation to justice and my classroom? Who are my trusted colleagues? And then what can I do? So we'll circle back to these questions, but I want to keep kind of bringing this back to action and reflection and not just the theory. Okay, so I'll give you just a minute to read this over. This is where I see like the scales of justice as it relates to our educational praxis playing out in a lot of different ways. So I'll just give you a minute to read this over. Again, micro is at the individual level, micro, meso, and macro. So these are just the different ways that we can think about justice in these different levels. All right, so if we could, in the chat, looking at this very long list, which it's long on purpose because it means that justice is everywhere potentially, but if you can just put into the chat, what are the things that you think about all the time? You know, what are the things that like keep you up at night, or that when you're taking a shower in the morning, you're like, how am I going to incorporate justice into my lesson plan? Or how am I going to talk to my colleague who's an administrator about changing the whole language policy for teaching assistants? Or, you know, what are the kinds of things that you are thinking about on a regular basis in your professional practice? You could do this in two different ways. Either you could just write like, I always think about micro things. So just you could put micro in the chat, or you can put specific things from this list, like institutional structures or language policies, what have you. So as you are ready, you can just put into the chat the kinds of things that you are thinking about on a regular basis. Maybe your top three, if you have too many to pick from. Good. Okay, so I'm seeing, yeah, so Nicole is mentioning like, how do we initiate and sustain these conversations across the disciplines? Yeah, and so it just depends. Yeah, mostly micro, some micro. Lesson planning, materials development. Yeah, and depending on your positionality within your institution, you might be an administrator yourself, so maybe there's more institutional conversations going on, or those are the things that you think a lot about. Okay, Paula's, yeah, that's great. How can I let the individual student be an individual? Guiding teachers and content and method, having an institutional framework. Great, perfect. Yeah, and I think Doa is mentioning, Doa, would you actually be willing to unmute and say a little bit more about that in terms of where you feel like you can contribute? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Well, as a language learner, I feel like I can be connected to my students. I relate to them. I understand where they're coming from. And as a language educator, I feel that I can also make a difference in my interactions with them in the classroom. I was fortunate to work with language learners here in the United States in higher education. So I have some flexibility with the content that I teach in class and the practice as well, because I can modify things. I think because of this, this connection with the students, who I am and what I can do in the classroom, I feel like I should even be doing more all the time because I have control over these two. It also allows me really to question who I am and so examine where I'm coming from all the time. So that feedback between myself and my students is an ongoing learning experience for both of us. The meso and the macro levels, I feel like these two, I was actually writing this when you're asking me to talk. I feel like these two levels tend to influence each other more, and whatever I decide, different ideology that is revealing at some point and its impact on the meso level and vice versa, the meso levels, practices or structures tended to either enforce that ideology or challenge it. Whatever the result is usually has the highest impact on the individual and the practice and the teaching that we have. Because at the end of the day, the policies are what basically define that. So it can actually limit what a teacher can do to help their students, or actually can also do the opposite of encourage teachers to be more attentive to issues of social justice in the classroom. So that's how I view the relationship between all four levels.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and just looking also at Chuck's contribution. I mean, I remember hearing at a workshop once, like, the system is in all of us, so the idea that like, oh, the system's out there, obviously not true. So, and it's just kind of a heuristic for us to look at the four levels as if they are separate, but, language policies are impacting ideologies and ideologies are impacting individual students, and all of them are all mixed in together. So thank you, Doa, for also, highlighting that in terms of recognizing the interconnectedness. So just to build on some of that and think more particularly about the role of language and social justice. So in our edited volume from a couple of years ago, we highlighted 5 different components of the relationships between language and social justice. And I know Jesse also was mentioning like power structures and the role of language in kind of perpetuating those. So we were talking about, different case studies around the world that were that the authors were writing about that were focused on language access, equity in terms of language users and the opportunities that they have, available to them in the structures that exist, power, privilege, and marginalization. So I'll just show a few case studies of what this looks like. So, just as an example, language access, if we're thinking about like access to Spanish interpreters in healthcare settings, which I know, a lot of people work on, that's one example of how we can ensure justice through access to language. So just to add to that, some of the ways that we've been thinking about it, and there's a lot of scholars who've worked on this as well, is the ways that we use language to engage with and or describe the world, and also the languages and speakers who do and do not have power, right? So we're looking at how language and language change and social change are interconnected. So that can be at many different levels. If we're looking at issues like language and race, and I'll show you some case studies of that, language and the education system, like bilingual education, or how we think about minoritized students' language use in the classroom. As I mentioned, healthcare access and how that's related to language use, language and social activism, and also language, law, and broader policies. So I can share with Carly some of these resources as well if you want like the full citations or anything like that. So just to give a couple of key examples. So if we're acknowledging, let's say, that we know that there are inequities that exist in society and language is part of that. And our intention is to then do something about what we're noticing. So there are 4 case studies that I'm going to share with you before we look at some scenarios together, where a group of us were looking at kind of the steps to go through if you're noticing that there's injustice and that language is related to it. So the first step would be noticing, observing, reflecting, and critiquing. So if we're noticing something like the students in my classroom never had access to bilingual education, and we notice that, right? We notice that that's the case, we observe it, we reflect on it, and we critique that is how the system functions. And so in this process, we're centering the role of language and social justice, and we're recognizing our own positionalities. And some of you have already been kind of exploring that together about who am I in relation to these students, in relation to these issues, and then collaborating in order to make social change, and then eventually raising awareness about the issue. So, so this involves a long-term, in-depth understanding of issues, contexts, and communities, alongside active engagement and collaboration with others. So the work that we've done, these are for many, many years we've been working on this. The first is a case study that focuses on the language gap. This is the idea that children from minoritized backgrounds speak, have 30 million fewer words than other more white middle class classmates by the time they're 3 years old. And we have problematized this idea because it's a deficit model of students that aren't the mainstream. And so we've undertaken these 5 steps to really see what's wrong and then try to raise awareness in the broader communities about this. Another example that we could think of the relationship between language and social justice is sports team mascot names. And we talk a lot about in our work how this is redressing public naturalized racism in lots of different spaces, sports, events, media, etc. And then also the I word, so using the word illegal to refer to immigrants and how that is a process of dehumanization that is connecting the immigration system with how we think about individual people. And then the last example is census category. So recognizing the broad range of languages that people use and not only defaulting to focusing on how much English people know, but also recognizing the other languages they may know. So this is just to give some examples of how we can think about the very, very specific relationships between language and social justice. And so what I'm hoping that we could do, and we can also reflect on what I've just shared, is to think about what are some of the language and social justice issues or topics that are important to you, either in your classroom or even just in your daily professional lives. And then how might you bring those topics into your educational practice? And as we mentioned earlier, what tensions might arise as you explore these? Is it institutional tensions? Is it internal tensions? Is it tensions with your students, et cetera? So I'd like for us to surface a little bit of that together, and then we're going to look at some scenarios. So here, we're not just talking about social justice more broadly. Oh, I see. I see what you mean. Yeah, Moshe, could you, if you might be willing, could you just ask your question so that I can hear it, and then I'm happy to respond. Oh,
can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, thanks.
Oh, the question I was asking was, you brought up how using the word illegal when referring to immigration is dehumanizing. I don't really understand the connection. I want to know if you could explain it more. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So the idea is, and thanks for the question. The idea is that even if a person, whoever it is, whether they are an immigrant or a citizen of a particular place, even if they might be engaging in something that is considered, they're engaging in an act that is considered illegal, given the current legal system or the current policies that are in place, that the person themselves is not illegal. So it's sort of like picking apart, like sort of putting labels on people based on a series of actions that they're taking. That's what we have been trying to problematize that idea. Right, exactly. So like same thing, if you call someone like, if you use the label for someone experiencing housing insecurity and you use the label like that's a homeless person, that idea of like, or he's homeless, that is, if we're thinking of it like a descriptor versus just like that's their entire being, right? We're trying to kind of think through that a little more deeply about like, that person is experiencing housing insecurity or they're experiencing X, Y, or Z, or they've done X, Y, or Z actions, but that isn't necessarily the way that we might want to describe that in person as a whole. So that's the idea behind it. But yeah, thanks for raising it. I mean, it's all, everything that I'm going through very quickly, we could explore for the whole time we're together, but that's the intention. Yeah, thanks for the question. Okay. So if we might put into the chat any specific things that come to mind as they relate to language and social justice. So in your own classroom, in your personal lives, things where you're seeing that intersection between justice and language, we can put those in the chat. And then we're going to look at some kind of practical applications for our last 20 minutes or so. So there's great stuff already in the chat, but I'll wait a moment as we're reflecting. So far we have like calling students ELL in elementary school, racialization of non-native accents, the use and promotion of lesser used languages, and then destigmatizing different dialects. Standardized language, equaling professionalism, penalizing students from deviating, local languages and preservation. Good. Great. So let's just use as an example, Jesse, if you might be willing, would you be willing to share how do you see the use and promotion of lesser used languages as an issue of justice? Like, so that we can sort of together think about, like, even if these examples feel like, yeah, that's an example of justice in language. Can you say a little bit more about how you see that connection?
Yeah, sure. So I work with a very numerically small language called Cornish in southwestern Britain. And the people who have spoken Cornish and other small languages, lesser used languages, oftentimes find that the decline of their languages is due to social pressures, due to discrimination, discriminatory practices, due to racism and outright, repression of language use. Sometimes sort of covert, sometimes overt, and even violent. And that people being able to, I believe that people being able to speak the language of their choosing is a human right, and that these systems that are an example of linguistic injustice.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I mean, it's a great example of the ways that how individual speakers and how entire languages are perceived, discriminated against, how people are targeted as a result of that, and as Jesse mentioned, overt and covert ways. And within, I see a lot of what we're talking about here has to do with institutions, and how the institutions that we're all a part of are either, part of that problematic system, part of the solution, maybe somewhere in between, and how each of us individually, for ourselves and for our students, how can we create these spaces where the students feel like, I can explore this, I can learn this language, I'm interested in it. So that's really what we're trying to go for. So thank you, Jesse. It's a very good example for us to explore together. So just looking at everything we've talked about. So we've talked a little bit about Praxis. We've talked about kind of frameworks for thinking about justice. We've talked a little bit about examples for how language and justice are interconnected. So for the last 15 or so minutes that we're together, I'm going to share with you, it's a framework for thinking through, how to integrate justice and language and equity into your classrooms and settings. And then we'll do one more round of breakout rooms where I'm going to share with you 3 scenarios of things that I tried to make them general enough so that they feel doable for all of us. To just think through together, how might we handle these situations? How might we be proactive to avoid them, etc. So I'll share this with you. It's just called the Equity Literacy Framework, and some of you may be familiar with it already. The idea being that if we are trying to create spaces where students' languages and who they are honored and valued in every space they move through, that we are able to recognize, respond, and redress inequities or biases, and then create and sustain spaces where students feel like they can be their full selves, and where all of us feel that way. So there's really like 7 steps that we can take. The first is just to recognize or identify what those biases or inequities might be. And so, acknowledging, like for Jesse's example, like just naming them, even just objectively, like what exactly is going on here that feels inequitable or biased. The second step to me is maybe not the hardest, but one of the hardest ones, because you have to take stock of all kinds of perspectives, including ones that you don't agree with. And so taking stock of all the perspectives that might exist around that issue, that bias or that inequity. Consider possible challenges and opportunities. So the pros and the cons, the positives and the negatives of how you might move forward in relation to that bias or that inequity. And then collectively with others that you're working with, imagining equitable and just outcomes, brainstorming both immediate term and long-term solutions, and then crafting a plan of action. So for me, like I'm trying to do this as much as I can, even like every day before I go to sleep, like how did my lesson go today? What was going on there? Like kind of make sense of it so that at my next class, I can make it feel better or different. But you can also do this like at an institutional level, at a programmatic level. So hopefully it feels adaptable. Are there questions, reactions to the framework itself? Anything you want to share in the chat or unmute about? Does this seem cool, interesting, too hard? Any reactions that we have, because I'm going to try to apply it in our scenarios, but I'm just curious what we think about it. I'm going to stop sharing just to. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so Jesse is asking, why is there a separation between immediate term and long-term solutions, which I think is a fair point, because I think they're always really interconnected, and a lot of times the immediate solution builds towards the long-term solution. My understanding of the framework, and it's relatively new to me, but the framework is sort of, I guess, designating that you're picking those apart, like distinguishing them, maybe helps you go into more depth for each, so that you're like really like, well, what exactly am I doing at the immediate term? For me, for my classrooms, I'm like, okay, well, if something keeps coming up, well, next time I teach the class, my syllabus needs to say something else or whatever. So to me, that's different, but building off of the immediate term. So, but it's a totally good point. Yes, so great. So Doa is mentioning including constituents' input in the process. And so I think, and again, I'm just showing you like a little piece of it, but there's some resources that you'll have access to later. I think recognizing like who is there to make these decisions and like who's coming together to craft the solutions and all of that is a really important step, even before you sit down to do the thing, right? So it's like, who's actually deciding what the solutions might look like and making sure everyone's involved in that. So Doa, I would actually, for sure, I would add that more explicitly into the framework. So how do we feel about sure, yeah. How do we feel about applying this to some scenarios? What do we think? Okay, so we'll get into some breakout rooms.